Deep in the Appalachian holler, the Crowe family lived miles from the nearest road. Folks said their lanterns burned red at night, and that screams echoed through the valley. When a preacher finally visited, he found a house the mountains themselves seemed to have swallowed. The front door hung askew on leather hinges. Inside, 17 chairs surrounded a table set for a meal that had been cooling for 3 days. But it was the cellar that made Reverend Samuel Morrison flee back down the mountain path, his horse's hooves striking sparks against the stones. What he discovered beneath the Crowe homestead would haunt Burke County, North Carolina, for generations. Carved into the cellar walls were names and dates spanning 40 years. Below each name, a small iron hook. From those hooks hung braided locks of hair in every conceivable shade: blonde, auburn, silver, black. Some still held traces of scalp. Morrison counted 87 names before his lantern flame began to gutter. The final entry, carved fresh into the stone, bore his own name and tomorrow's date. The Blue Ridge Mountains of western North Carolina had always harbored secrets in their hollows and ridges. In 1878, Burke County stretched across terrain so rugged that entire communities could vanish into its folds, emerging only when desperation drove them to the county seat in Morganton. The Crowe family had claimed a valley 12 miles southeast of town, accessible only by a deer path that wound through laurel thickets and over creek beds that swelled impassable during spring rains. Ezekiel Crowe had arrived in these mountains sometime around 1835, leading a wagon train of kinfolk from the Tennessee border. Local records show he purchased 400 acres from the state land office for $57, paying in silver coins that bore Spanish markings. The transaction raised eyebrows among Morganton's merchants, but silver was silver, and the mountains held enough empty space to swallow a dozen families without notice. The Crowe homestead sat in a natural amphitheater of granite cliffs and white pine, where morning mist gathered like smoke and evening shadows fell early. Their cabin stood 3 stories tall, built from hand-hewn chestnut logs chinked with river clay and moss. Outbuildings scattered across the hollow suggested a family of considerable size: a dairy house, smokehouse, corn crib, and what appeared to be a workshop whose windows stayed shuttered even during daylight hours. For 43 years, the Crowes maintained minimal contact with the outside world. They appeared in Morganton perhaps twice yearly to trade mountain ginseng and handcrafted furniture for salt, coffee, and iron goods. Store clerks noted their peculiar appearance: pale as cave fish, with eyes the color of winter sky, and hair so light it seemed almost white. They spoke in whispers and never lingered after conducting business. Children born in Burke County during those decades grew up hearing whispered warnings about the Crowe Hollow. Don't wander past the lightning-struck oak. Don't follow the creek beyond where it bends north. Don't listen to the sounds that carry down from their valley on windless nights. Samuel Morrison arrived in Burke County on October 15, 1878, appointed by the Methodist Conference to establish circuits among the mountain communities. At 34, he possessed the combination of evangelical fervor and physical stamina necessary for riding circuit through terrain that defeated weaker men. His horse, a sturdy gelding named Job, carried him across ridges and through valleys where the gospel had never taken root. Morrison kept meticulous records in a leather-bound journal, noting each family visited, their spiritual condition, and their willingness to receive regular ministry. His entries from late October reveal growing concern about the Crowe family, whose very existence seemed disputed among his new parishioners. October 23, 1878, inquired about souls dwelling in the southeastern hills. Mrs. Abernathy claims knowledge of a family called Crowe, but will not speak their names aloud. When pressed, she crossed herself and declared some folks best left to their own counsel. The Crowe family appeared in county records sporadically. Tax assessments listed Ezekiel as head of household with numerous dependents, but no census taker had ever successfully counted their number. Marriage records showed unions between Crowe family members dating back decades, suggesting a clan that preferred to keep its bloodlines concentrated within the hollow. Morrison's evangelical conscience would not permit him to ignore souls dwelling in spiritual darkness, regardless of local superstitions. He spent 3 weeks gathering intelligence from storekeepers, blacksmiths, and traveling peddlers who might have encountered the Crowes during their infrequent trips to town. What he learned troubled him. The Crowe family traded goods of exceptional quality: furniture carved with intricate designs, metalwork that showed uncommon skill, and ginseng roots of unusual potency. But they demanded payment only in silver, refused all paper currency, and conducted business with an urgency that suggested fear of lingering too long in populated areas. November brought early snow to the Blue Ridge, but Morrison could not shake his conviction that divine providence had led him to Burke County specifically to minister to the Crowe family. He set out on November 8th, following directions pieced together from reluctant informants and his own survey of mountain topography. The path to Crowe Hollow began innocently enough, following Muddy Creek through stands of yellow birch and hemlock. But as Morrison climbed deeper into the mountains, the landscape began to feel oppressive. Trees grew closer together, blocking sunlight even at midday. The creek's cheerful babble faded to an ominous whisper. His horse Job grew increasingly agitated, requiring constant reassurance to continue forward. 3 miles from the main valley, Morrison encountered the first sign that he was entering Crowe territory. A pile of stones stood beside the path, carefully stacked, but serving no apparent function. Carved into the topmost stone was a symbol that resembled a tree with roots and branches extending in all directions. But the proportions seemed wrong, as if designed by someone who had never seen a tree grow naturally. Similar stone markers appeared at regular intervals as the path climbed toward the hollow. Each bore the same twisted tree symbol, but the carvings grew more elaborate and disturbing. The final marker, positioned where the path crested a ridge and revealed the Crowe Valley below, showed not just the tree, but figures dancing beneath its branches. The figures appeared to be holding hands, but their heads were tilted at angles that suggested broken necks. From the ridge, Morrison could see the Crowe homestead spread across the valley floor, like a wound in the forest. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, but the smoke was the wrong color. Too dark, too thick, carrying scents that made his horse shy sideways. What appeared to be human figures moved between the buildings, but their movements seemed choreographed, as if performing some elaborate ritual dance. Morrison steeled himself with prayer and urged Job down the final slope toward whatever awaited him in the valley that the mountains themselves seemed eager to forget. Silence between the ridges. The Crowe family emerged from their buildings as Morrison approached, moving with the fluid coordination of schooling fish. 17 individuals arranged themselves in a perfect semicircle around the cabin's front porch, ranging from children who appeared perhaps 8 years old to elders whose age defied estimation. All shared the same unsettling characteristics: pale skin that seemed almost translucent, white blonde hair, and eyes the color of glacier ice. Ezekiel Crowe stood at the center of the semicircle, a man of perhaps 60 whose bearing suggested absolute authority over his kinfolk. He wore homespun clothes of excellent quality, but his boots showed craftsmanship that surpassed anything available in Morganton's shops. When he spoke, his voice carried the rhythms of mountain dialect, but underneath lay something else, an accent that suggested origins far older than the Appalachian settlements. "Reverend Morrison, we've been expecting you," Ezekiel said, extending a hand whose grip felt cold as creek water. "Word travels fast in these mountains, and we heard tell of a preacher riding circuit through the county." Morrison accepted the greeting while studying the assembled family. The children stood motionless as statues, their eyes tracking his every movement. The adults displayed expressions of polite interest, but their smiles never reached their eyes. Most disturbing was their absolute silence. 17 people gathered together. Yet Morrison heard no conversation, no shuffling of feet, no clearing of throats. They communicated through glances and subtle gestures, as if sharing some telepathic connection. "I've come to minister to your family," Morrison replied, fighting the urge to remount his horse and flee. "To bring the gospel to souls who may not have heard salvation's message." Ezekiel's smile broadened, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp. "Why, Reverend, that's mighty kind of you. We've been hoping for spiritual guidance for quite some time. Won't you stay for supper and evening prayer?" What would you do, standing in that hollow with 17 pairs of pale eyes watching your every move, knowing the nearest help was 12 miles away through wilderness that had already claimed strong men? Morrison felt every instinct screaming retreat, but his calling as shepherd to lost souls overruled self-preservation. The Crowe family ushered Morrison into their cabin with hospitality that felt simultaneously genuine and theatrical. The interior revealed craftsmanship of extraordinary quality. Furniture carved from single pieces of walnut, floors polished to mirror brightness, and windows glazed with glass clearer than anything Morrison had seen outside Charleston's finest homes. But it was the details that unsettled him. Every doorframe bore carvings of the twisted tree symbol he had seen on the stone markers. The mantelpiece held 17 identical wooden figurines, each carved to resemble one of the family members with uncanny accuracy. Most disturbing, every mirror in the house had been covered with black cloth, as if the family feared their own reflections. The dinner table accommodated exactly 18 people, 17 Crowes and one guest. Morrison's place had been set with silver that showed no tarnish despite obvious age, and his chair bore armrests carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The family arranged themselves according to some predetermined hierarchy, with children seated between adults in alternating patterns. During the meal, Morrison attempted to gauge the family's spiritual condition through careful questioning. Their responses revealed knowledge of biblical stories, but interpreted through a lens that seemed fundamentally warped. When Morrison mentioned Christ's resurrection, young Martha Crowe observed that death was merely a pause between dancing. When he spoke of salvation's gift, old Nathan Crowe replied that gifts always come with obligations. The food itself defied explanation. Despite living 12 miles from the nearest neighbor, the Crowes served vegetables of impossible freshness for November, meat of varieties Morrison couldn't identify, and bread that tasted faintly of herbs he had never encountered. When he complimented their self-sufficiency, Ezekiel smiled and said they had arrangements with local suppliers. November 8th, 1878. Sup with the Crowe family. 17 souls dwelling in isolation, showing signs of religious instruction, but lacking proper understanding of salvation's requirements. Food excellent, but of uncertain provenance. After supper, Ezekiel invited Morrison to lead the family in evening devotions. They gathered in the main room, arranging themselves in the same semicircle formation they had used outside. Morrison opened his Bible and began reading from Psalms, but his voice seemed to echo strangely in the cabin's interior, as if the walls themselves were listening. As he read, Morrison became aware of an underlying rhythm that matched his cadence. The family was swaying almost imperceptibly, their movements synchronized like pendulums, keeping time to some unheard music. When he paused to turn pages, they stopped swaying. When he resumed reading, the motion began again. Young Sarah Crowe, perhaps 12 years old, raised her hand during the prayer. "Reverend Morrison, what happens to souls that get lost between life and death?" The question struck Morrison as oddly sophisticated for a child of her apparent age. "God calls all souls to salvation, child. None need remain lost who seek redemption." "But what if they don't want to be found?" Sarah persisted. "What if they like being lost?" Ezekiel placed a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder, and she fell silent instantly. "The child asks many questions, Reverend. We encourage curiosity in our young ones." After prayers concluded, the family began dispersing to their sleeping quarters with the same eerie coordination they had displayed all evening. Morrison was offered a bed in the cabin's second-floor guest room, which contained amenities that surpassed most hotels in civilized areas. Yet as comfortable as the accommodations appeared, something about the room troubled him. The walls held no decorations save a single painting that depicted the valley from an impossible aerial perspective, as if viewed by someone floating high above the treetops. In the painting, the Crowe homestead appeared exactly as Morrison had seen it, but the surrounding forest showed clearings and structures that didn't exist in reality, or perhaps existed at a different time. Morrison woke near midnight to sounds that had no place in a remote mountain hollow. Voices singing in harmony, but the melody followed no Christian hymn he recognized. Footsteps moving in patterns across the cabin's floors, as if the entire family was participating in some choreographed ceremony. From his window, Morrison could see figures moving between the outbuildings, carrying lanterns that cast red light instead of the yellow glow of ordinary flames. The figures moved in procession toward the building whose windows remained shuttered, the workshop he had noticed during his arrival. Driven by ministerial duty and growing unease, Morrison dressed quietly and descended the cabin's stairs. The main room stood empty, but candles burned in holders he hadn't noticed earlier, and the wooden figurines on the mantelpiece had been rearranged to face his guest room door. Outside, the November air bit through his coat, but Morrison followed the procession toward the workshop. Through cracks in the shuttered windows, red light flickered in patterns that suggested activity within. The singing grew louder as he approached, revealing words in a language that definitely wasn't English, yet somehow familiar, as if he had heard it in dreams or nightmares. The workshop's door stood slightly ajar, revealing a glimpse of the interior that made Morrison's breath catch. The building housed not a woodworking shop, but a library of extraordinary scope. Books filled shelves that reached from floor to ceiling, but these volumes showed bindings of leather that seemed to move in the candlelight. Tables held open manuscripts covered with symbols similar to those carved into the cabin's doorframes. Maps covered one entire wall, showing regions that didn't appear on any geography Morrison recognized. At the room's center stood a lectern holding an enormous book bound in what appeared to be human skin. The family was gathered around this book in their familiar semicircle, but now their movements revealed the choreography Morrison had sensed all evening. They swayed in complex patterns that created shadows dancing across the walls, shadows that seemed to move independently of the bodies casting them. Blood remembers everything. Morrison retreated to his room, but sleep proved impossible. Every sound in the cabin seemed magnified. Footsteps in hallways, doors opening and closing, whispered conversations in that unknown language. Near dawn, the sounds ceased, and Morrison heard the family returning to their normal sleeping quarters. He waited until sunrise, then approached Ezekiel under the pretense of requesting a tour of their remarkable homestead. Ezekiel agreed with enthusiasm that felt both genuine and predatory, leading Morrison through outbuildings that revealed the Crowe family's true scope of activities. The dairy house contained no cattle, but shelves lined with glass containers holding liquids of various colors. The smokehouse showed evidence of recent use, but the meat hanging from its rafters came from no animals Morrison could identify. The corn crib held not grain, but bundles of plants that gave off medicinal fragrances, and others that made his eyes water. "We're largely self-sufficient," Ezekiel explained. "These mountains provide everything needful for those who understand their gifts." When they reached the cabin's rear entrance, Ezekiel gestured toward a cellar door Morrison hadn't noticed the previous evening. "Our root cellar holds preserves and such. Family recipes passed down through generations." The cellar stairs descended farther than necessary for simple food storage, reaching a depth that put them well below the cabin's foundation. Oil lamps provided illumination for what Morrison initially assumed was an ordinary storage area. Barrels lined the walls, labeled with dates going back decades. Shelves held hundreds of glass jars containing preserved foods of remarkable variety. But carved into the cellar's stone walls were names and dates spanning 40 years. Below each name hung a small iron hook, and from those hooks dangled braided locks of hair in every conceivable shade. Some still held traces of scalp. Morrison's host watched his reaction with careful attention. "Family records, Reverend. We keep track of everyone who's touched our lives." Morrison counted 87 names before his lantern flame began to gutter from lack of air. The final entry, carved fresh into the stone, bore his own name and the next day's date. Samuel Morrison, November 9th, 1878. Morrison's blood turned to winter as he stared at his own name carved into the cellar wall. Ezekiel Crowe stood beside him with the patience of a spider watching a fly realize the web's true extent. In the lamplight, the hair samples seemed to move with their own life, swaying in air currents that felt too warm for November underground. 43 years we've been in this valley," Ezekiel said conversationally. 43 years of hospitality to travelers who lost their way in these mountains. Circuit riders like yourself, government surveyors, revenue agents hunting moonshine stills, peddlers carrying goods between settlements. Morrison forced himself to examine the carved names more carefully. Some he recognized from county records, men who had disappeared while traveling through Burke County's remote areas. Others bore dates suggesting they had vanished before Morrison arrived in North Carolina, their fates unknown to anyone outside this cellar. "Each one came seeking something," Ezekiel continued. "Some wanted souls to save, like yourself. Others hunted criminals or collected taxes. A few just needed shelter from storms." He gestured to the hair samples. "We give them what they seek, in our own fashion." The oldest entries dated to 1836, just months after the Crowe family's arrival. Thomas Whitley, September 14th, 1836. Below the name hung a braid of brown hair tied with faded ribbon. Morrison remembered hearing about Whitley, a Baptist preacher who had vanished while riding circuit through the mountains 42 years ago. Statistical analysis revealed the true scope of the Crowe family's activities. They had entertained approximately 2 visitors per year since settling in the valley, suggesting a network of communication that allowed them to identify suitable candidates well in advance. Government officials who entered the mountains seeking the Crowes never returned to file reports. Private citizens who stumbled upon the hollow were never seen again. "How do you choose them?" Morrison asked, surprised by his own steadiness. "The mountains choose," Ezekiel replied. "We just listen to what the mountains tell us." Ezekiel led Morrison deeper into the cellar, revealing chambers carved from living rock that extended far beyond the cabin's foundation. These rooms contained the true evidence of the Crowe family's nature and purpose in the Blue Ridge Mountains. One chamber held records written in multiple languages, documenting what appeared to be genealogical information spanning centuries. The Crowe family tree traced bloodlines back through European origins, but the names and dates suggested something impossible. The same individuals appearing across generations that should have seen them dead from old age. "We ain't exactly what you'd call a normal family," Ezekiel admitted with understatement that bordered on humor. "Our people been wandering for a long time, seeking places where the old ways can take root. These mountains called to us like they called to the Cherokee before us." Another chamber contained implements that clarified the fate of previous visitors. Tables scarred by use that Morrison preferred not to contemplate. Containers holding materials he couldn't identify but suspected were human in origin. Books describing procedures that seemed to blend medicine with practices that predated Christianity by millennia. "The Cherokee understood," Ezekiel explained. "They knew these mountains hold powers that most folks can't comprehend. When they moved west, they warned us about places where the earth itself hungers. We didn't listen proper at first." Morrison began to understand the Crowe family's true relationship with their environment. They weren't simply murderers hiding in remote mountains. They were something far older and more deliberate. The isolation, the coordination, the uncanny knowledge of approaching visitors all suggested a group that had spent generations perfecting their methods. "Every family's got traditions," Ezekiel said. "Ours just run deeper than most." The final chamber contained Morrison's real education in the Crowe family's covenant. Bones arranged in patterns that followed mathematical principles Morrison recognized from his seminary training in ancient languages. Symbols carved into stone that matched designs found in archaeological sites across Europe and Asia. Evidence suggesting the family maintained connections with similar groups scattered across continents. "We ain't the only ones," Ezekiel admitted. "Got cousins in the Scottish Highlands, the Carpathian Mountains, places where old blood still flows strong. We write letters, share knowledge, keep the traditions alive." Traditions older than memory. Morrison found himself facing a decision that his seminary training had never prepared him for. The Crowe family stood before him not as parishioners requiring salvation, but as representatives of something that existed outside Christian cosmology entirely. They offered him a choice that seemed to suspend the normal rules of mortality and morality. "You can leave," Ezekiel said simply. "Walk out of this valley, ride back to Morganton, forget you ever seen us. We'll carve your name off the wall, and you'll never hear from us again." Morrison felt the weight of 87 previous visitors who had faced similar offers. "What's the price?" "Simple silence. Don't speak of what you've seen here. Don't come back. Don't send others." The alternative remained unspoken but clear from the evidence surrounding them. Morrison would join the archive in the cellar, his hair braided and hung beside those who had chosen differently or had been given no choice at all. "How many have accepted your offer?" Morrison asked. Ezekiel's smile revealed depths of satisfaction that chilled Morrison's soul. None yet. Seems folks who come huntin' truth ain't much inclined toward convenient forgetting. Morrison understood the trap's true nature. Men of principle, preachers, lawmen, government officials, couldn't simply walk away from evidence of systematic murder. Their moral codes demanded action regardless of personal consequences. The Crowe family had spent 4 decades studying such men, learning to predict their choices with scientific precision. The funny thing, Ezekiel continued, is we genuinely mean it every time. We'd rather have neighbors than enemies, but neighbors got to mind their own business, and you people never could learn that skill. Morrison realized he was witnessing the final moments of a pattern repeated for 4 decades. Every man who entered this cellar faced the same impossible choice: compromise his principles to preserve his life, or maintain his integrity at the cost of joining the archive. "What happens if I refuse both options?" Morrison asked. "Then you get to learn what the Cherokee meant about hungry mountains." Morrison spent his final night in the Crowe cabin understanding that he was experiencing his own wake. The family treated him with elaborate courtesy, serving his favorite foods and engaging in conversations that revealed their intimate knowledge of his background, his calling, and his character. They had been studying him long before his arrival. "We know about your wife, Martha, back in Asheville," young Sarah Crowe mentioned during supper. "How she worries when you're riding circuit through dangerous country." Morrison hadn't mentioned Martha to anyone in Burke County. The Crowe family's intelligence network extended far beyond their mountain hollow, suggesting connections and resources that made their isolation seem deliberate rather than necessary. As the evening progressed, Morrison gained insight into the family's true nature. They weren't mad or evil in conventional terms. They were practitioners of traditions so ancient that Christianity appeared like a recent innovation by comparison. Their methods were refined through centuries of experience, their coordination perfected through bloodlines that had never diluted. "We tried conventional life once," Ezekiel explained. "Scattered across settlements, married into normal families, pretended we was just peculiar mountain folk. Didn't work out. Normal folks can sense when something ain't quite right, even when they can't name it." The Crowe family had learned that isolation provided safety, but isolation required resources. Visitors provided those resources, not just material goods, but information, skills, and ultimately the life force that sustained their unnatural existence. Each person who entered their valley contributed something essential to their continued survival. 43 years of hospitality adds up, Ezekiel observed. 87 contributions to our family's welfare. We honor every one of them. Morrison realized that his presence completed some pattern the family had been following. His name carved in the cellar wasn't prediction, it was appointment. The Crowe family operated according to schedules and cycles that treated human lives like natural resources to be harvested according to seasonal requirements. November 9th, 1878. The family gathers for our annual Thanksgiving, right grateful for all the Lord provides. Morrison woke on November 9th to silence that felt absolute. No bird song, no wind through the trees. Even the creek had stopped its babbling. The Crowe family was gone. He searched the cabin and found it stripped of everything that had suggested human habitation. The furniture remained, but personal belongings had vanished. The carved figurines were missing from the mantelpiece. The mysterious books from the workshop had disappeared. Even the black cloths covering the mirrors had been removed, revealing glass so clear it seemed like windows into another world. In the cellar, Morrison discovered the final truth. His name had been carved from the wall, leaving only a smooth patch of stone. The other names remained, along with their accompanying hair samples, but fresh chisel marks showed where his entry had been carefully erased. A letter waited on the lectern where the skin-bound book had rested. Reverend Morrison, you chose different than we expected. Most folks in your position can't walk away from a fight, even when fighting means dying. Maybe you understand something about mountains that others missed. Your name's gone from our records. Don't come back. Don't send others. Some secrets are meant to stay buried in the deep places where they can't hurt nobody else. Morrison rode out of Crowe Hollow that morning feeling like a man returning from his own funeral. The path seemed different, shorter, more direct, as if the valley itself was eager to expel him. By afternoon, he reached Morganton with no clear memory of the journey between the hollow and civilization. Morrison's official report to the Methodist conference contained no mention of the Crowe family. His journal entries for November 8th and 9th were blank, though he had written detailed observations about every other day of his ministry. When questioned about his circuit through southeastern Burke County, he claimed to have found no families requiring spiritual attention. County records from 1879 show the Crowe property listed as abandoned land, previous owners unknown. Tax assessments ceased after 43 years of regular payments. The land office could find no evidence that anyone named Crowe had ever owned property in Burke County, despite decades of documentation suggesting otherwise. Morrison completed his appointment in Burke County, but requested transfer to a different district. His subsequent ministry showed marked changes in style and focus. He avoided remote areas, concentrated on established congregations, and developed a reputation for refusing to discuss certain aspects of mountain folklore. Private letters between Morrison and his wife Martha, discovered after his death in 1912, reveal a man haunted by knowledge he couldn't share. "There are things in these mountains older than our faith," he wrote in 1879. "Some doors should never be opened. Some paths should never be taken. I learned the value of ignorance when wisdom would have killed me." The Crowe Hollow remained empty through the 1880s and 90s. Hunters reported that game avoided the area. Loggers found the timber infected with some blight that made it worthless for construction. Government surveyors noted geographical anomalies that made accurate mapping impossible. The valley seemed to shift its dimensions depending on the viewer's perspective. In 1901, a new family claimed the abandoned Crowe property. The Sinclairs arrived from parts unknown, purchased the land for unpaid taxes, and established a homestead that locals found uncomfortably familiar. They were pale as mountain mist, spoke in whispers, and visited town only when necessity demanded. The Sinclairs lasted 7 years before vanishing as mysteriously as their predecessors. After their departure, Burke County authorities decided the valley was too remote and too troublesome for settlement. It was designated as Forest Reserve and left to the mountain's own devices. Modern GPS systems show no valley matching historical descriptions of Crowe Hollow in southeastern Burke County. Satellite photography reveals unbroken forest, where settlement records indicate human habitation existed for nearly 50 years. The United States Geological Survey lists the area as containing unmappable terrain features and advises against recreational hiking. Local families still pass down warnings about certain paths that seem to lead deeper into the mountains than geography should allow. Park rangers report occasional missing persons cases involving hikers who followed creek beds beyond marked trails and never returned. Search and rescue operations in these areas are consistently unsuccessful, often ending when rescue teams themselves become disoriented and require evacuation. In 1993, construction workers building a telecommunications tower in the Blue Ridge discovered a cache of documents buried in a metal container. The papers included maps of southeastern Burke County showing settlements that had never appeared on official surveys, genealogical records for families with no trace in county archives, and correspondence between remote mountain communities across multiple states and countries. The documents were turned over to state historians, who declared them elaborate fabrications and filed them in archives where they remain classified. The telecommunications project was abandoned after workers reported equipment malfunctions and unexplained accidents that made the site too dangerous for construction. But on still November nights, when mist rises from the valleys and sound carries farther than it should, residents of Burke County still hear voices singing in languages they don't recognize, carried on winds that seem to blow from hollows that don't appear on any map. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.